check day. Happy mic check day, everybody. Check, check, check. Check. Check, 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 check. myself, so that's a good sign. Yeah, welcome to the live stream. This is the first one we've done, and this is the first one I've ever done. I'm one of the developers on the Tête. Camille, he's in the chat room. He's our lead developer. Yeah, let's dive in. If you have any questions or patch ideas or anything that you want demoed towards the end of the stream, drop them in the chat room. Camille's gonna compile a list, and then we'll go from there. If the audio's all good, then I'll keep going. All right, so the Tête is the expander for the Tetrapad, and the Tetrapad is 4 touch-sensitive strips, and so they sense position, pressure, and then the touch gate. The Tête also has 4 encoders and then 8 assignable outputs, and so depending on what mode the Tetrapad or the Tête is in, it's gonna each thing will do something slightly different. We've color-coded the LEDs so that you kind of have an idea of what mode you're in and then what those outputs are going to do. The Tête is an expander brain for the Tetrapad, and it offers some additional outputs and then 3 assignable inputs, CV inputs, 2 assignable trigger inputs, clock input, clock output, and then a full step sequencer and a looper for the modes in the Tête. Yeah, I'm just going to adjust the camera and zoom in, and then we'll do a dive into the UI. All right. So, like I said, the Tête, it also adds a display, so you can kind of see what's going on the Tetrapad. And I'm just going to give you a general UI tour here. And we'll go from there. So on the main screen of the Tête, the top portion is this is the mode display. So the top like 2/3 of the pad or the screen is where you're going to see what's going on in the mode that you're in. And so we have 3 modes. So in notes, you'll see a keyboard, and you'll see the keys that are getting output on the Tetrapad's outputs. You'll see the scale you're in. You'll see the root note of what you're playing, what octave it's in. The middle line here, that's the encoder bar. And so that's going to show you what your encoder is affecting. And so whether it's a loop setting or you're touching or bypassing the pad. And then this is the same. Voltage mode is the same, where you have the top section is the voltage mode setting. It's saying what all your 8 outputs are doing. And then the bottom section at the bottom is the looper or the sequencer, depending on what mode you're in. So yeah, the design thought that went into it is that the looper and the encoder bar are always going to be in the same place. So you're always going to know like what your encoder is going to affect, and then you're going to know where you stand as far as your recordings, sequences, or loops go. There's a few buttons on the Tête. We made a big effort to reduce menus and things like that. If anyone of you has used the Rainmaker, it's kind of a 1 button per function. We have a very similar thought behind this. So holding down the setup button gives you mode, holding down the CV button gives you file. And so those are the 4 main menus in the Tête. So if we hold down mode, we end up with our mode select menu. If we tap setup, we end up with our settings for the mode. If we tap CV, we end up with our CV assignments. And then if you want to save a preset or load a preset, you can go to the file manager by holding File. We have a dedicated clock button, so you can tap tempo. If you hold that, you can toggle between internal or external clock, and then you can adjust down to the decimal point, a single decimal point. This is a loopy button, so similar to the loopy mode on the scales or on the steppy. You can loop portions of your loop or sequence and have those repeat, and then have your playback snap back to where it would have been, or you can have it smoothly leave where you were looping for a little more experimental stuff. There's a play button and a record button. The looper and the sequencer both kind of operate on those primarily. On the Tetrapad, a lot of you haven't tried it. The white button goes into edit mode, and the bottom button is like a shift. And so it either toggles a second page of configuration, or you hold it and move another control to adjust that control. But we'll dive into those in a little bit when we get into the modes. The CV setup menu is pretty simple. At the top, we have three, I'm hoping you guys can see this. We have three small meters, and that kind of shows you what's coming in via the CV jacks. The ones marked with the asterisks are gate or trigger related, and the rest are CV related. And so at the top, you assign your outputs, and then you assign your trig input, your reset input, X, Y, Z. And depending on the mode you're in, you'll have access to different options there. The file menu is pretty simple. If you want to save a preset, you choose it here, put in the file name, hit OK. And then when you want to load it, you can load it. So what a preset holds is either your loop or your sequence, plus loop or sequence, plus all of your mode setup options, and all of your like pad state of what state you left, what notes you assigned to what keys, things like that. When you load it, you can load it with or without CV assignments. If you're going through multiple presets but have the same physical patch going, you would probably load without CV assignments, so your CV is not constantly getting reassigned. Yeah, so I think with that, we'll get into notes mode. That's what was playing before we started here. Turn it up. Okay, I'm just gonna zero these out. All right, notes mode. So I'm just gonna talk about the Tetrapad real quick, and then we'll dive into a little more on like what the Tête is doing. Notes mode outputs 4 voltages at the top, and so we're using a Atlantis. We're using the mod oscillator as a second voice, and so it's kind of a paraphonic setup. And so we have a pair of notes coming out from each key. We have it assigned by scale, so we're choosing a scale from a menu. We can also set up how many pads we want, up to 16. So now we get a chord worth of information at the top, and so we can rotate that. So you can hear the different notes that are coming out of the 4. We get a position. I'm just going to drop this back to 4 for a demo. We get position CV of where your finger is on output number 5. And then on output number 6, we get a pressure output. That can be adjusted in the settings and can be either really responsive or like quite a bit slewed and like come in later, like aftertouch. If you want to do like filter sweeps and stuff, position can be a little more like manageable for dialing that stuff in. On 7 and 8, we get a trigger output and a gate output. And the gate stays high as long as your finger's on the pad, and the trigger stays high every time it just gives a flash. Like I think it's a 10 millisecond trigger. So let's go through the menu options for this. We go into setup. We can choose a looper or a sequencer, and then that changes some of our options in here. So let's jump in with the sequencer. We have the sequencer clock going at times 1, so that's based on our incoming clock, which we're using the internal clock right now. Swing, 50 to 78%, just like steppy. Loopy position sync, so that's if we're going into loopy mode and looping just a portion of the loop, are we going to maintain the original position, or are we just going to come smooth out of the loop? So we'll let it snap back. Pads allows you to set up to 16 rows. You can kind of see the pads light up on the Tetrapad here. 16 gives you access to kind of the most octaves worth of your scale. As you increase or decrease, you get more room for that position output. And so when we're on 8, it splits the pads into 2. That's still pretty playable. 12 is still pretty playable. You kind of roll your finger around. As you get to 16, that position output gets a little bit hard to manage. But if you're not using that and you just want access to a lot of like a large range of keys without having to scroll through octaves, that's there. So I'm going to leave it on 8 for now. As far as note assignment goes, you can assign with a scale, chosen right here. It's the 35 scales are from scales are programmed here in the same order, except for we put chromatic at the front. So you can audit those as you play. Sometimes it's good with like 16 pads, and then yeah. Let's go major. Oops. Back to 8. I'll jump in here once. There's a global setup menu. This is kind of a one-time settings menu just for everything related to the Tête and the Tetrapad, and it applies to all modes. So there's a pressure curve, and these 3 settings that are in here are from the Tetrapad and actually writes the data back to the Tetrapad. So you'll probably come in here once and set it up, and then that's it. Let's do the sequencer. Okay, so it starts at 0. It works kind of like a 101 sequencer or the scale sequencer, where you hit record and you enter your keys. The way you control the gates on this is with the encoder. And so if you turn all the way to the left, you're going to get res, and then it'll go 25, 50, 75, or a tie. And so as you add notes to this, you can change the gate lengths. And then you can see here that it's adding your steps. And so if we hit play, it cycles through the steps. If you hit record again, it goes into kind of like an append mode, and so you can add more steps. If you toggle the encoder, so if you click the encoder, it goes into overwrite mode, and you can actually scroll back and change the note on a step, or like go an octave lower or an octave higher. And then if you tap the encoder again on a step, you can edit whether it's a rest. You can change the gate length, tie slur, 75% gate, like those same options. And so as you scroll around, you can edit these steps. If you have an extra step that you added, you just hold the encoder on it and it will delete that step. When you're editing, if you tap the loopy button, you'll toggle between insert and overwrite mode. Insert mode will add steps to where the cursor is in your sequence. And so you can toggle out of it, and then to get back to append mode where you're adding to the end, you just scroll the encoder to the end. That's the basics of the sequencer. You can also overdub live into it. Or if you're just playing over, you can overwrite and then it will snap back. Let's jump back to notes mode controls a little bit and let's explore the encoders up here. So the first encoder changes your root note. As you scroll, it'll also start jumping octaves. If you tap it, it'll reset to C0. The second encoder changes your octave. All the way down to 5. The outputs on the Tetrapad are plus minus 5 volts max. The third encoder rotates the outputs of your chord. So if we hold this, let's go up a little bit. You can kind of get some really cool, in the demo patch I had earlier, there was an envelope triggering that rotation after the pad was released. And so you end up with like these nice trills when you release the note. The third is inversions. And so you can kind of see on these LEDs, hopefully they're bright enough. Rotating this inverts and modifies the octaves of the 4 outputs. Tapping any of these resets it back to its original state. The way the sequencer works as well on this is it's recording the gate information, like what gate setting you had set up with the encoder, as well as the 4 pitches that are coming out. So if you change your keyboard settings but keep playing back the loop, the loop or sequence will keep playing back to what you originally recorded. You can use CV to modify that, but these controls here are mostly affecting what you're going to be recording or overdubbing back into the looper. Yeah, so that's the looper. Let's cover the CV inputs. Let's see what they do. So our outputs, well, let's do the outputs first. So on sync, it's a trigger only out. So it can't output any CV, unlike A and B, which can output plus minus 5 volts. So sync can output a clock, a run clock, which only outputs when the sequencer is running. It can output a touch clock, which only outputs a clock when you're touching one of the pads. So we put our sequencer back on, or our steppy. Can get it to advance when we touch the pad. We change it to play. It outputs a gate every time you hit play. So you can use that as a reset. You can also output it on stop. And so when you stop the sequence, it'll output a gate. You can also use that as a reset depending on what module you're trying to sync the transport with. We have a run, which just outputs a solid gate. I'm just going to pull these out. So when the sequencer is going, that outputs a solid gate. End of loop, end of sequence. So if we assign that, when this hits the end, it'll fire a trigger on the last step. Oops. If we set that to start of loop, start of sequence, it'll fire that trigger on the start of a loop. So when you stop it and hit play, it'll trigger. You can also use that as a reset if you're trying to sync something with a different amount of steps to your amount of steps in the loop. Touch. That would just output a gate when the pad is touched. And those are the gate options. A has a few more options. So all of the gate options are also available on the A and B and the CV outputs. That goes for the inputs too. The gate only inputs can also be assigned to the mod inputs X, Y, Z, and that'll ignore the attenuverters. So play, stop, run, touch, loop position. This outputs a ramp based on the position in a loop. And so if we have something like planar, which I don't have in this rack, that has a scan mode where a voltage from 0 to 5 will scan that whole recording on the planar. And so if you plug this into that, whatever position you are on the loop will be that same position in the planar. And the planar will time stretch its modulation based on the position in this loop. And that includes doing the loopy mode where you're looping between a portion of it, which I'll show you in a minute. Touch again, loop position. Yeah, those are our output options in notes mode. Let's go to the trig inputs. The clock input is always a clock input. It's not assignable. When you plug in an external clock there, you would change the source to external clock, and that would allow you to clock the Tête. Let's keep this going. So our options here are reset. You can assign reset to either of these jacks. By default, reset is always assigned to reset. But we realize not a lot, or some people don't use reset when they're doing their sequencer stuff. Run. That actually gates the running to an external run high, and so the sequencer would have been playing, except for this is assigned to run, so now it's waiting for a high gate to actually do the running. Mod trig, I will explain that in a second. Looper, this works similar to the input on the planar, where you can use an external trigger source to trigger the looper starting, stopping, overdubbing, things like that. Toggle loopy, this toggles on and off the loopy mode or the sublooper. Gate loopy, this does the same, except it does loopy when it's high and goes back to normal when it's low. And those are our options there. So in notes mode, we have quite a few modulation destinations. So we have our gate related ones. We're gonna skip past those. Loopy length. You can actually modulate how many steps loopy is going to loop when it's enabled. Loopy shift, you can shift that window around on your sequence. I'll show you guys that in a sec. Slew, this one's simple. It increases the slew between the notes. You can kind of hear how the slew sounds there. So you can modulate that. So if you had slew and you give it negative voltage, it'll dial it back. If you have no slew and you give it positive voltage, it will increase the slew. Slew clock. In a lot of our CV assignments, we have 3 or 4 options per assignment. Clock means that input is going to be sample and hold against the clock signal. And so it's every clock beat, it's going to resample the slew CV, and it's only going to apply it for that. It's going to apply that static value until it gets another clock beat. You can also do that on a trig, and that's what I was saying earlier. When you assign trig to mod trig, you can do it on either a divided clock, on a completely different module. You can trigger anything assigned to like slew trig or octave trig, and it'll sample and hold against the trigger input. Pad is similar. It's a sample and hold again, but it's against your touches on the pad, or when the sequencer plays back a touch on the pad or the looper. And so you can do slew, and it's a constant rate, and you're constantly modifying the slew with LFO or whatever. And then if you set to clock, it's going to start stepping that against the clock. If you do it against trig, it's going to step that against a trig input. And then if you're going to do it against pad, it's going to do it whenever the note changes, or the pad is pressed. Okay, so that's slew. Semitone, I'm not going to go into all the sample and hold options for all of them. Most of these destinations have them. Semitone will bump your whole sequence up by a semitone. That changes the input to a volt per octave, and it will ignore the attenuverter. Again, sample and hold against clock, trig, pad. Octave. This will increase or decrease an octave. This is not volt per octave because we realize like you might want a weirder LFO or a different source to kind of make it jump multiple octaves. So you can dial that in with the attenuverter or backwards and actually drop octaves. Sample and hold options. Rotate CV. Just gonna plug one in here. So we're on X. I'm just gonna plug it into channel from my triplet, and then open the attenuverter. So you can see that we can put a modulation source in here, but this is actually modulating the output rotation on here. And so we get a different set of the chord notes because we're only using 2 oscillators. But otherwise that would split this between, it would rotate your pitch outputs to whatever 4 oscillators you had plugged in. We go to inversion, that's the same thing. The effect is not super great on this because we only have 2 voices. Yeah. Octave, so here, this is a good example of, so this is live. I turn the knob, and it's affecting it instantly. If we set this to clock, it only affects it on a clock pulse. And if we set it to trig, it's waiting for a trig signal to come in there. If we set it to pad, and stop this, it's only modulating that octave when we touch the pad. Octave. Inversion, rotation, yeah. That's all the destinations for CV in voltages mode. In voltage mode, the sequencer is accessible, and also the looper. This is the same for voltages mode. Combo mode doesn't have a step sequencer in it, just because of the difference in how it works and how it's recorded. It only has like a looper. Let's go through some of the options in the menu here for notes mode. So the sequencer, you can multiply or divide the clock. If you multiply it, you lose access to the swing setting, just because we're interpolating in between the clock beats now. And so times 4, oops. 3, 2, 1. You can also divide the clock going into the sequencer. And then we can add some swing. Let's speed that up again. And then loopy position sync. Kind of went over that quick, but I'll show you guys that in a sec. Yeah. Okay, so let's dive into loopy. I'm gonna turn off the swing. Gonna clear my loop. If you hold record, if you have a loop and you hold record, it'll wipe it out. There's no undo for that, which is why it's a long press. If you have a loop and you pause it, pressing play will start and stop, or pause and play. If you hold down play, it'll reset to the beginning. So more like you hit stop and it starts over. I'm just gonna do a quick ramp like that, and then we'll jump an octave. And then it looks like we have the same notes there. Okay, so we're just gonna ramp, lock these 15 steps in. If we hit loopy mode, it's gonna stop our cursor where it is, and then you set how many steps you want to subloop. And so as we dial this back to 1 or 2 steps, so you can also do momentary. So if you hold loopy down and then release, it'll snap back. And then as it's going, you can increase this. If you tap the encoder while you're looping, you get loopy shift option. And you can actually move that that window around. And so as you tap the encoder, you're toggle between shift and edit. And so you could pre-program a sequence just to have a whole bunch of sets of notes or arpeggios, and actually just like scroll through them and use this as like just an arpeggio generator. If you added that with the run input, you could only have it active when you press a key, things like that. This will also loop around the back. So it'll loop around. If you assign CV to that, you can have that actually toggle itself on or off, and then skate around on your loop and kind of jump around everywhere. That's loopy in the sequencer. It's slightly different in the looper. The functions are the same, just the way it operates is a little bit different. Yeah, and I would say that is notes mode. We're going to jump into voltage mode. If there's anyone has any questions for notes mode, maybe I can hit those up real quick. Release date, it's already released. Shipping to dealers. Loop, it's possible to use a gate to advance. Yeah, you can plug whatever you want into the clock input. Obviously, that would mess up any swing timing or things like that, because that's calculated on the time between 2 clock pulses. But if you had no swing, then yeah, for sure, you could advance it on whatever you want. Yeah. Okay, let's jump into voltages mode. So we're going to hold down setup or mode and jump to voltages. Voltages mode is, I'm just going to clear it out. It's 16 banks, up to 16 banks. So you can either do 8, 12, or 16, just like you're splitting the pads in notes mode. Sorry. Just like you're splitting the pad in notes mode. 8 voltages are assigned to each bank. And so this patch is probably not going to work. So let's say goodbye to that. Just going to pull these. Some ASMR for everyone. All right. The way you assign them is with the encoders. So we're in bank 1. We're setting output 1 with this encoder, output 2 with this one. These can be positive or negative voltages. And then when we want the second 4 banks, we press the shift button to toggle that side. And then these become 5, 6, 7, 8. And so you can see on the screen, we have each one of our assigned outputs shown here that match the level up here. If you hold the encoders in turn, you can adjust fine tune down to like 0.01 volts. Yeah. Slew is set in all modes by holding shift and then turning the encoder. And so this will slew between, this is a lot of slew, and you can see it slowly crawling back to 0, which is what all the outputs are set at on this bank here. As we decrease slew, you can see that kind of go faster or slower. And so that can be modulated and stuff as well. So there's a shortcut for randomizing everything. It's also available in the menu. So if you hold shift and press white, you'll randomize all the banks. And so we're just going to get a complete random set of voltages here. The shapeshifter sounds cool, so I'm just going to patch that up real quick. Let's do the, I'll go through the menu real quick before maybe we jump into this. We're going to set this one to looper, and I'll cover some of the looper options after. Looper. Just like notes mode, you can set this down to 8 voltage sections. We don't have a position out. Actually, that's not true. We have a position out available as assignable on the A and B outputs. But if you're not using that, you may want more banks. Or if you're addressing the banks with X and Y voltages from the CV inputs, you may want more just to kind of skate around on. But you can go 8, 12, or 16 banks. There's an option to clear the banks from the menu. These will verify before you do it. And there's an option to randomize the banks, just like the shortcut. The shortcut for clearing is hold shift, hold white. That will wipe out all the banks, and then hold shift, tap white, and you can randomize all the things. There's a scale and a scale root option in here. Set this to major pentatonic. Let's do D. This, all of the outputs in here, you can optionally assign them to be quantized. And so you can see which set of notes you're editing by where the bar is on the top. And so as we toggle that, or it's green on the left, red on the right. We can quantize the output that's assigned to the encoder. And so if we tap the encoder, on the Tetrapad, blue outputs are always pitch-related outputs. Green and red are always voltage, either positive or negative. Teal outputs are pressure. Position will come out as a green voltage. That's just a voltage level. And then gate outputs are output as magenta or purple. Okay, so we're going to quantize the outputs on 1 and 2. And those will be quantized to the scale chosen in the options here. Okay, real low here. So you can hear the quantization there. This. This is something else. randomize things. So, so as we tap around, we end up with basically a different preset. And so the more things we patch in from the Tête to the shapeshifter, the more variety we're going to get. So I'm just going to plug in. Let's see where we land. And so we can also slew this. So you can kind of imagine where you can get if you actually think about where you're patching. This is completely random, and we're getting some like pretty interesting results. Yeah, so let's cover on how the looper works in this mode real quick. I'm gonna hold that to clear it, and then yeah. So as soon as we touch it, it's gonna start, and there's options to control how this starts. So this is totally freeform. It's going to record my pad presses as I add them. The limits are basically the size of the SD card, although the UI is really focused on like kind of 5 minutes or less as far as recording goes. And so I'm just going to play that back. And so this is going to play back the recorded bank, and the touches are playing back on output B. So I could actually trigger something else with the touches versus the outputs on here. Loopy in here works slightly different in that it'll hold on a sample, and it's kind of like granular CV. So as we open that up, now it's playing about 2 seconds of audio before it loops, and then as we tighten that up, and then if we do slew, that'll obviously have a slightly different effect on it. We're also in overdub mode, so we can actually overdub new data to that, even just that sub loop. And then we can toggle out of loopy. And so in overdub mode, we can overdub pad presses as we touch them. And as soon as you're not touching the pad, it'll know not to kind of overdub on that area. We have some different options. So in notes mode, we had rest and tie, and then gate length as far as the sequencer went. This has a different set of options, and they relate to outputting a gate when you touch the pad. And so we have it on bypass, bank, and gate. And so actually touching the pad is not going to do anything. If we have touch gate only, then touching the pad is not going to change the bank we're in, but it's going to apply a gate on output B. And so kind of similar to the planar where you have a gate option and there's a gate recorded to the loop. This also has a gate kind of track recorded to the loop. And then the encoder gives you a little bit of control of when that fires and when it doesn't. So this is touch gate only. This is touch bank only, which means it'll change a bank but not fire a gate on output B here. Touch bank and gate, which is the default and kind of where most people will live, it's gonna do a change. It's gonna change the bank as well as like output a gate. As you're recording your loop or overdubbing, you can actually go, and if you want to take out the gate in some of it, you can do erase gate only and then just touch anywhere on the pads, and that'll wipe out the gate for that portion of the recording. It'll actually overdub no gate in place of a gate. You can also change it to record gate only, and so now we're recording gates, but the banks are changing still based on where they were in the loop. Record bank only. This is gonna change where the banks are, but the gates are gonna play back just how they were before. Record bank gate. Now we're overdubbing the whole thing. Yeah. Okay. Let's go into how the looper works. I'm going to wipe out this loop. So I'm just going to hold record. The slanted lines are no loop. Here's your looper options. So these are in the mode setup menu. And these are the same for all the modes that have a looper, which are all of them. Post-record, you can make the looper record a certain amount of beats or a certain amount of bars worth of information, and then it'll automatically loop after it hits that limit. This decides what's going to happen when you end your recording or when your recording ends automatically. And so it either goes into play mode, which means when we record and then hit play, overdub is not turned on. And so if we wipe that, change this to overdub, hit record, now we record something and hit play, it's immediately in overdub mode. And so if it's automatically wrapping, it'll smoothly wrap and overdub those changes onto the next like pass of the loop. If you want to be more protective and you don't want a change that's recorded after your loop, you can change it to play, and then when it starts looping back, it'll play back instead of overdubbing the information you had when you first played it in. Overdub. Recording wait. So you can turn that off. I've had it on. If you turn that off, as soon as you hit record, it starts going. It's not going to wait for you to touch the pad. If you're timing a record with something else, you may want to hit that and then start playing on your pads and then hit play. But yeah, the options are. If you turn that on to record, wait, touch, now it's going to wait. It's going to arm itself. It's going to kind of like pulse. And then as soon as you touch the pad, it's going to jump in. That record wait setting kind of integrates with the upcoming settings here. Looper sync. So if we turn that on, and this is similar to the planar, when record starts, it's going to start on a clock pulse, either internal or external, depending on where you're getting your source. And so I'm just going to turn the clock down. So we'll just set 60. Oops. And I'm going to turn this off. I'm going to turn this way down. So if we set it to 15, these are quarter notes. This is the pulse every second. And so you'll see when we hit it, it's going to wait. And then as soon as it gets that pulse, it's going to stop. When we hit it again, it's going to wait for the next thing. And then it's going to wait for the next pulse and then stop. And so our loop is always locked to those clock bounds. And so the looper itself, the input is not synchronized. The start and end points are. And so you end up with really fluid motions. You can do a lot of stuff off the grid. If your timing is really good, then you can kind of play along with everything else. But the looper is really meant as like kind of a free form, works very similar to an audio looper. In that it's like taking that input and it samples it at a millisecond or at 1 kilohertz. And so we're sampling all these inputs and stuff and then looping them at 1 kilohertz. So 1,000 samples per second. Whereas like a step sequencer would be kind of on the grid, and so it's going to sample every second, or every clock pulse, or 16th. Yeah, so back to syncing. Let's put this back up. Looper sync on. So if you turn that off, the looper is going to ignore the clock. It's going to do what you want it to do. If you turn it on, it's going to sync up the start and end points with the clock. If we set looper length to a number, this is actually the number of pulses. And so if you want if you're 4/4 time, you want 1 bar of modulation or whatever from voltages mode, then you're going to set it to 16. That will give you 16 pulses worth of information. This number goes up to 128 right now. I think we could probably bump it up from there. Yeah, so I'll show you how this works. So we're going to wipe out the recording. We're going to hit record. It's going to sync with the first clock it gets. And then on the 16th clock, it's going to actually just start looping. And so now we have 1 bar of information here. If we change this to touch, so we're waiting for touch again. Let's try this out. Then it's going to wait for the combination, and this is kind of like an end, of my finger going down and a clock pulse. So now we get a loop, 1 bar loop. If we have other sequencers or whatever going, it's just going to sync up with that. We can use the run and stop stuff to sync transports with like the micro MIDI or a MIDI module, and have it reset and then play this modulation back on time. And because we're only recording really the gates and the pad presses, we can modulate and change the slew on that kind of in real time. We can also change the values of the out of the banks, and the loop will actually change because now the values of those banks are different. Because we're just playing back the bank number. We're not playing back, and then the bank number is giving us the voltages. We're not recording the voltages and playing them back like notes mode. All right. Looper sync, looper length, clear banks. I'm going to turn the looper sync off to show you one of the options here. Because we have a loopy position sync. And what that means is when you are looping with loopy, it kind of maintains its own position here. When you leave loopy, so if we turn position sync on, and we loop, and we tighten this up, when you release it, the looper is gonna the playhead is gonna go back to where it would have been if you didn't use loopy. And so if you want to keep your start and end points exactly in time with the rest of your patch or whatever, you can dial that stuff in. Okay, if we turn loopy position sync on, your position's actually going to start to get looped inside loopy. And so if we loop like this inside here, when we release loopy, it's just going to smoothly exit as if that's where the position was. Or you can, like I said earlier, you can do momentary. So this will give you nice smooth exits from these. Where if we turn on loopy position sync, which is forced on when you turn on looper sync, because there's some assumptions there that everything's kind of gonna stay in time. So if we toggle it on, this is snapping back, so it's a little bit more, in this patch anyways, it's a little bit more jarring. In other patches, it's probably a little more natural for it to snap back to what you've been hearing already. If we change that off again, then in this weird patch, it like sounds pretty smooth, just come like naturally out of that loop. Yeah. Let's go through our CV inputs for voltage mode. Sync outputs are going to be relatively similar to the other modes. You have touch and sound or start of loop and end of loop. Those options. All the transport options are the same in all of the modes. The only additional one in here is a bank change option. And so you can get, so whether or not you're recording loops, gates and stuff to your loop or your sequence in voltage mode, you can make it so that you get a bank change option regardless of whether or not you recorded a gate. And so that'll happen anytime the bank changes. So we have the sync output set up to that. Anytime the bank gets toggled, we're getting a trigger. Pressure. Since this mode doesn't have a dedicated pressure output on it, we add it to the Tête. And so as you go, you can get pressure output there. Pretty subtle on this random patch. Yeah, and the rest are the same. The rest of the outputs as notes mode. So we're gonna go into, this one sounds nice. All right, trigger inputs. Very similar again, gate loop, reset, mod trig for the sample and hold against the trigger, looper controls, loopy controls, but then we get into like random and bank advancing, and this will let us move the touch position around on the bank on the grid of banks. So I'm just going to set this 16 because it's a little more interesting. So this is going to give us a random. It's going to plug this into trigger input, and we're going to assign the trigger input. And so I just have it plugged into the FSR. And so every time I tap the FSR, it's going to toggle a random bank. And so you can sequence this with another, and this is just a trigger. It's not CV. You can sequence this with another sequencer or whatever clock source you want or trigger source. Bank forward. This is going to advance forward. And so starting at 1, going to 16 at the top right, 1 at the bottom left. This, every time it gets a clock, it's just going to advance forward. Bank reverse, we'll do the opposite. If we set this to output the clock, you can actually just self-patch and get it to advance itself without using the looper or the sequencer. Bank X, that's only going to move on the X-axis, and it's going to advance 1 to the left or to the right every time you every time it gets a trig. It's also based on where your finger is. So if we move that row, we can set up basically presets, and you could set up one set here, have them morph slightly on this row, have them morph slightly on this row, and then you can cycle through those various things with just a trigger. If we change to Y, it's very similar. So it goes from the bottom up, and you can tap and change which sets you're working to. Of course, you can run multiple, and so if we assign reset to bank X and trig to bank Y, we've put our clock into trig, and I've put the FSR back into bank, and so we can actually move like what these are cycling through. The XY is just on, I just saw the question. The XY pattern stuff is just voltages right now. But you can quantize the outputs. So, and you can get the trigger out and the gate out. So you could use this to drive quite a few oscillators. Okay, I'm just gonna stop those. So that's bank forward, bank random, bank forward, bank reverse, bank X, bank Y. Those are our trigger options for banks. We also have a bank XCV and a bank YCV. I'm just gonna scroll back to make sure I didn't miss anything. I'll just start with the banks. I don't have a planar, which is very fun with bank X and Y. You can dial in the attenuverter so that your joystick will actually move the 8 voltages around on the tetrapad. So I just have this plugged into a triad that you can't see. So one is moving. This takes a CV as opposed to a trigger, and so it's plus minus 5. You can see the CV at the top on the X, and this is moving the position from where I have it clicked, and so just on the X, and then I have a second channel plugged into Y. So now we can skate around that. We can plug an LFO into it. We can plug a second LFO into the other one. Now we get Cartesian mapping of the 16 sets of voltages. And so if that had a bit of slew on it. Also do no slew. The one thing I should point out, the trigger inputs on the bank modulation. So if we do bank random or linear or if we do a bank forward, bank reverse, bank random, all those trigger bank assignment movements, those all happen before the sequencer or the looper. When in case of the looper, it will actually record those advancing motions as if you touch the pad. What they won't do is affect the loop if the looper is playing back. And the reason for that is because they're momentary, and the looper is constantly refreshing the data every millisecond of what it was playing back. The CV modulation on bank X and Y or forward and back happens after the looper. And so you can record a pattern change and then CV modify where that pattern is playing back. So if you recorded a loop that was just playing like left and right on one row of voltages, you could move that row with CV or self-patch and have the loop, have the voltages from voltage mode actually play back and affect like where the loop is playing. So we have XCV, YCV. These options are also available in the sample and hold variety, again against the clock, the mod trig, or the pad. Same for X and Y. We also have a bank CV, which just modulates it straight. And so plug this back in. Oh, to Y. Oh, no, it's X. There it is. This is like the forward or reverse, except it'll just scroll through your banks linearly as opposed to X and Y. Let's cover some of the other options in here. Again, the same options as the other modes: toggle loopy, gate loopy, loopy length, loopy shift, slew. The slew in voltage mode and combo mode is a lot more extreme than in notes mode. Notes mode is dialed in for kind of playing melodies and things like that. It goes a little bit long, but like you can get up to I think it's about a minute if you go from extreme voltages from like a -5 to a +5. I think you can get about a minute as for that transition. So really long drones, things like that. Level is an interesting one. If you assign something to level, then that input acts as an attenuverter for all of the outputs. And so as I move the attenuverter, you can see that all of the outputs are actually opening up. And if that's zeroed out, then it's basically like an internal VCA, but for all of the outputs. And then, conversely, it'll invert if you give it a negative voltage into level. But you'll notice if you assign something to level, that all your voltages will zero out if you have no CV coming in. And that's because we need to zero it out until it gets a reading. You can also clock and modulate or sample and hold those. There's an offset. This adds an offset to all of the voltages and will push some of them from positive to negative or negative to positive. Again, you can self-patch for voltage mode. This is really cool when you start throwing like playing back a loop and then modulating like how extreme those voltages are. If we change this back to level, that's really again, these are applied after the recording, so you can see on the screen here that stuff getting played back through kind of an attenuated version. Yeah. Offset, so level and offset, if you're familiar with the VCA, those are kind of your two main controls. So we set this to offset, it's kind of the same thing. So if we turn off level, then all of our stuff's going through at what we set, except we're offsetting those values into the positive or into the negative. You can kind of see everything move around on the screen there. And then those happen before the slew. And so when you turn on a little bit of slew, you actually end up with like, it's pretty fun to watch everything fly around through that center point. Scale root. So you modulate the scale root. Yeah, pretty straightforward. That only affects the quantized out positions. I don't know if we're going to hear it very well in this patch. Bank random, those are the gate options. Those are also, like I said, available on the XYZ. Bank CV, that's the linear CV that I covered. And you can see it playing back here from the looper. I'm going to make a really simple loop and show you how this... So I'm going to record just these four. So we're going to hit 1, 2, 3, 4, and then play back. So it's just going to play those. If we So we have CV assigned to bank, so we're going to advance it a little bit. So now those four are going to play back starting at a different point. And then if we dial that back a little bit, it's going to start playing back from probably here, here. If we set that up as, let's do YCV. Now, so because YCV, we have no voltage applied, it's playing back what we recorded. As we increase that, we can shift that up to this row now. And so now we're playing back that same pattern of recording on a row above. And then we can move it again up one. We can move it down if we give it a negative voltage. Again, self-patching in voltage mode against this stuff. You just end up with crazy variations that you just couldn't. And all of it happens like as you touch and move. You can touch a pad. That voltage changes the offset, so the thing jumps from underneath your finger. Some very cool stuff in there. X works the same, so you can offset the start point of the loop. Linear works the same. You can just offset your whole loop. When you're not playing back a loop, those X and Y offsets happen from where you touch. And so if we touch in the corner, like all that movement's going to happen based on where we are on the corner. 0 is going to be where you touched, and then +5, -5 are going to wrap it around. CV. That's all of our CV in voltage mode. The level and offset, yeah, like I said, are just really cool to play around with. Okay, let's check for any voltage mode related questions here. I didn't cover loop recording in notes mode. Someone asked the question. The looper works the same in notes mode as it does in voltage mode. I think we'll do some videos later on with like a little more kind of focused, in-depth, step-by-step. The CV notes recorded. So this is Spetsnaz, easy names. Are the CV notes recorded or quantized? Recorded quantized or unquantized? They're unquantized. So in combo mode and voltage mode, when you quantize the output, that happens after the fact. And so you're actually recording, in voltage mode, we're recording the bank changes, not the voltages. And so we're playing back bank 1, which has these 8 set of voltages, and they are either quantized or not quantized, and that can be toggled on and off kind of live. You can only record one sequence and one loop. And so it's it's not a multi-track recorder. It's recording the input of all the pads and that whole mode, those gestures against one single kind of timeline. It has an SD card. It comes with a 16 gig. There's probably not any point in putting a bigger one in. Like a few hour recording, if you ended up doing something like that, you'd have to sit there and give it input for that long. Probably only like 10 or 12 megs or 20 megs. So you probably won't be filling up the card anytime soon. Does not record incoming CV right now. Yes, voltage mode can be quantized. It handles. You could do audio rate. Someone asked if it can do audio rate. Because of the communication between the Tetrapad and the Tête, there's always a little bit of delay for all those things, and it's in the millisecond, 2 millisecond, but that kind of affects how fast a clock you can send to it. The tap tempo caps out at, I think, 480. Yeah, and so it handles tempos like that, no problem. We're in a looper, so it's not gonna really do anything. Let's see. Someone was interested in the I2C handling. It's really just used to communicate between the two. We haven't really explored communicating outside of these modules with the Tête. Someone asks if there's two I2C connectors on the back of the Tête. Any chance you can connect multiple tetrapads? We didn't want to close off the possibility, but I don't really want to kind of get into that right now. It's launching with support for one tetrapad. Someone asked, different mode. Yep. Okay, let's cover combo mode. Unless there's anything. Yeah. Combo mode. So I reset this mode just so it's a little less scary for everyone. Combo mode splits the tetrapad into four separate modes. And so each column is a pair of jacks, the encoder, and then the touch strip. And so by default, you get 4 faders. These all operate independently, but they're recorded to the same loop with the same boundary. There's no sequencer in combo mode. Sequencing the loop, the fader position and stuff is a lot less interesting than like a really smooth movement. And so we found that it just kind of wasn't really interesting. And you can accomplish like very similar movements like that in voltage mode by dialing in the voltages as you kind of move up. Yeah, so there's no, we'll just go into the setup menu really quick. You have the looper options. There's no option to toggle the looper or the sequencer. One of the modes is LFO. We have sync options to sync it to the clock. We have options to reset the LFO, either when you get a reset from the input, or you can reset it every time the looper or sequencer wraps, and that kind of syncs up your LFOs with the recorded movement. There's a Euclidean generator that we will cover in a sec. That has a swing option. Again, you can quantize some of these outputs, and that quantizes to the scale and the route that you set in the menu. So, combo mode, all the pads function almost exactly, all the extra functions you use to set up a pad are almost the same in every, with each one. And so you press the white button to select your pads. And so as you, it'll knock it out inverted. And then as you scroll through them, you end up with a visual representation of the mode plus the an animation to kind of match. And so you can either look at the tetrapad or the screen when you're setting these up. We have I'm just going to play on pad 1 here. We have a fader, so this just gives you 0 volts at the bottom, 5 volts at the top. Bipolar, so middle is 0, the top is 5, and the bottom is 5, or -5. We have a crossfader, which has different curves, and we'll cover that. But at a linear curve, at the center, each output is 50%, and then as you go up, the right output maximizes, and then as you go down, the left output maximizes, and you end up with the inverse. This paired with like the dual VCA makes a great crossfader. You don't plug the audio inputs into these. These are outputs only. These will control the level of something crossfaded against something else. Euclidean generator. You set your number of steps, your number of pulses on that step, and then you can set your pitch with your position here, or a modulation amount with your position here. Switches, really simple, 2 switches. You can latch them so that they stick when you press them, like toggle switches, or you can make them momentary, which is the default. As LFO, a lot of this code is from the Quadrax LFOs. I'll get into those a little deeper in a second. Let's start with the basics and just do faders. Faders, they can be latched. So latching in combo mode is always pressing the encoder. If the mode has a latch option, that's how it is. That's where it is. So you tap that, blue will light up for latched, and now it'll stick to wherever you leave it. And so if we latch all these, we can leave those positions where we stick them. Good for like setting up a mixer with a couple channels. Yeah. To adjust slew, I'm just going to turn off latching. You hold this and turn the encoder, and it's separate for each channel. So you can have different amounts of slew on each one. And then it's slewing the position on the pad. And so if we turn this up, you can see the position slowly creep up to my finger and then slowly creep back down when you let go. And then, so these are both set to different amounts. You kind of see them. One's quite slow. These slew settings are the same as voltage mode. So like voltage mode, you can get a super long slew, especially if you latch and have slew on, it'll slowly creep up to where you latch it to. And so you can touch them. You don't have to sit there and watch it or hold your finger there or anything. You can just latch them and have them like skate around on those values. Whereas these are no slew, so they jump around really quick. So that's the main. So you can latch and you can control slew with the red button. Again, white button edits these. So you're selecting the mode. If you tap the red button, that's like a red edit or settings page. And you'll see the display change slightly. In combo mode, it shows you a little bit more information about what settings are on the pad. In here, we're going to look, and when you're on the red page, turning the encoder will adjust the level. And so this mode was in the Tetrapad without the Tête, but it was always like 0 to 5 from bottom to top. In this, you can pre-attenuate, and so we can go from 1 to 5 volts. And so going to the top only gives us 1 volt now. And so we can change that to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Tapping the encoder turns on quantization for the voltage output. So this position output now is quantized. It's showing blue. This one is unquantized, just showing green, like a straight voltage. So that same methodology, blue is pitch, carries out through here. It'll also show a little Q next to the fader. If you have slew on, it'll show a little S next to the fader. Sometimes the small amounts have like just a little bit of red in the LED. You can always check the red page to see if there's slew turned on any of your channels. So yeah, we can set like a 2 volt limit without using an attenuator on a different module or whatever. Okay, so that's pretty simple. That's the fader. Let's go through the bipolar fader. Exactly the same options, but your middle point is here. And going down gives you a negative, and going up gives you a positive. I actually forgot to cover the even outputs on the faders are your pressure. And so that's 0 to 5. It's not affected by slew. It's just straight pressure, just out of the jack. And that's on all these. So you get a separate pressure for each pad. As far as the hardware goes, these 4 pads are separated. And so you can use all of them at once. You can use some of them like they don't affect each other. You can multi-touch. You can't multi-touch on a single pad. It'll just find the middle point of where you're touching. Okay, so bipolar fader. It's like I said, it's exactly the same. You can go to the red page. You can adjust the levels. You can quantize the output. So now you would be going. So if we set the level to 2 and quantize it, you have +2 octaves worth of semitones in your chosen scale, and -2 octaves of voltage on the output. Crossfader. There's no quantize option for the crossfader, It's not really meant to handle pitch. This is similar to the bipolar fader, where the center point is the middle, except the 3 and 4 outputs here are inverse of each other, and they're positive. And so if we latch that, you can crossfade to the left or right. And then if we go to the red page and turn this, we set the level, and so you can crossfade just 1 volt, in and out of 3 and 4 up to 5. If we tap the encoder, that actually changes the curve, and so maybe it's hard to see on the camera, but it has 4 curves, and so this is linear, this is constant power. So the volume in the middle is at about 70%, and then it's like a exponential or logarithmic curve to go either way. And so when you're mixing 2 voices, this actually sounds much more natural when you go full to one and full and back full to the other. The middle point sounds a little more natural. We also have like a more DJ style cut where at the middle both are 100, and as you go down, one fades out, and as you go up, the other fades out from 100 to 0 from the center point. And then we have a like even more extreme like DJ cut kind of filter where only the last 20% of the pad actually cuts it out. So they both run at full 100 until you get to the last like 20%. Let's go back to pad 1 here. Euclidean. This one's cool. Our first output is going to put out a trig. And our second output is going to put out CV. And so it's going to plug it into a plunk. So this is matched up against your clock. And so we have good chill beat. And then mod. If you're familiar with Euclidean, this will make sense. If not, I will try to explain it. There's a few numbers here. So the top number is the number of beats you want per the amount of the second number. And so if we have the second number set at 16, then we want to spread out 4 beats over 16 steps. And so if we hold our finger on here, we're going to get quarter notes based on our kind of 1 bar worth of info. Just like the other modes, you can press the encoder to latch, and now it will hold that and run the loop. If we turn the encoder, we increase and decrease that number 4 to increase and decrease the number of beats spread over that pattern. The number on the bottom is the current position that channel is playing at. And the position starts at 1 every time you touch the pad when it's not latched. And so if we turn this off, I have plunk set to the hip hop kit. And so as we give it mod value, it's actually cycling through 3 or 4 presets on the plunk. And so if we tap at the bottom, we're getting kick drum. If we tap here, we're getting snare. If we tap here, we're getting hi-hat and then cymbal at the top. So if we hold our finger, you can see it's only repeating once because I'm not letting it go far enough to actually repeat to 16 again. So if we keep holding it or if we latch it, it's just going to keep going. And so if we increase this number to 4 back in our quarter notes, half notes, or eighth, eighth notes on 8, and then if we go up to 16, it's going to fire on every trigger. And then if we change our position, it's going to change what voice is firing with this patch. So if we go back to 8, you can kind of skate around on that. So if we loop this, we can hold record. I'm just gonna kind of pre-set up a zone here, and then turn it to overdub. So you can see that meter moving around, and it's just changing the preset as we do the loops. If we increase that to 16, now we're just getting variations and changes in our loop. So if we want just kicks, we're just going to hold down here. We'll get some 4/4 kicks. We overdub, like change in there. This loop is not sunk with our 16 steps, and so we can get a lot of variation and stuff based on that. Just gonna dub in this. I'm gonna set up a second Euclidean channel on another plunk. I'm just gonna load up the bell. So on this Euclidean channel, we're going to go to the shift page, and then we're going to quantize the output, which in this case is even, and we're going to plug that into pitch, and then we're going to plug this into trigger. That range is pretty high, it's 5 volts, so we're going to lower that to 2. Oh, and we're overdubbing. Okay, let's sync it all up. We're going to turn on looper sync. I'm going to go 32 pulses from the clock. Record wait for touch. Going to wipe this out. Just going to record the kicks in. Then we're going to change the scale because we're chromatic right now. Harmonic minor. D. Okay, so now we have these motions playing back. When you quantize the voltage output, it also quantizes it against the triggers being played, so you don't get weird pitch bends when your decay is really long. Because we've only recorded the pad input, we can change these other parameters and like increase the kicks. Or decrease them to 0. With your kicks, it's maybe a little weirder. With the melody, you can kind of like start to explore quite a bit of different variety in there. And then because you've recorded all of that motion, but we're only playing back based on a certain amount of beats, you end up with quite a bit of variety in there. And then we still have 2 other channels for modulation. And so we can just take, oh, and I recorded those because overdubbing. So I put one into decay and the other into decay. So on our first channel, we have this changing the pad. So I'm just gonna get lost in this for a minute. So this is 2 plunks and then the Tête and the Tetrapad. You can mute by just setting it to 0. You can also CV all of these parameters. So you can, if you're familiar with Euclidean, you'll know that there's usually a rotation parameter, and that's the starting point. On the Tête and Tetrapad, that starting point is when you touch your finger to it. One thing I mentioned earlier, but maybe you didn't show, was when you have recorded input like this, you can use the encoder bar and set the pad to actually erase the pad. And so we can actually knock out parts of this, and then every time the gate kicks back in, it's going to reset the rotation on the Euclidean. So if we just set this to 1, it's going to fire once every time the gate comes in. So you can see that bottom number resetting. If I go erase pad and just erase both of these, it'll actually replace the input as if you didn't touch it or it was never recorded. And so on the first one, I'm maybe just going to latch it. And so set 4. Oops. So that's going, and then so every time I touch that pad, it's going to reset the Euclidean counter. And so this makes it much more, like a lot of other modules, you'd be programming that or like modulating that. This, you actually just touch it and you enter, and it kind of goes in. If you set this to 1 note, you're not going to get a lot of repetition. You're just going to get a quantized drum hit every time you tap the pad. If you increase this to 16, every time you touch the pad, you're just going to get a stream of triggers coming out. Yep. On the okay, we'll come back to these. Latching obviously leaves it on. You don't have to use the looper with this stuff either. You can modulate offset and things like that, and just have it play back with completely modulated. I'm going to leave those 2 plugged in and set up. I'm going to set the third one to LFO or switches. This is super simple. You toggle this to toggle latched, and then this becomes 2 5-volt gates. So you can finger drum, or you can latch and use it to turn things wet or dry, stuff like that. And you just get 2 switches for one for each output. There's no shift mode menu options. There's no slew. There's nothing like that. LFO mode. At the middle, it plays a 1-second phase LFO unless you clock it. If we turn the LFO sync on, now it's 1x against your clock rate, against the quarter notes. And then as you move up or down, that increases or decreases the, let's plug that into an oscillator. Yeah. Just gonna plug it into a sine wave. So as we go down, it decreases. As we go up, it increases. Okay, so that's just like really basic FM. The outputs are, the odd one is normal phase. The second one is basically 100 degrees out of phase, or the opposite of your first one. So, okay, it's simple. As we turn the encoder, we're actually changing the shape. And so it'll go from sine wave to triangle to saw to ramp, square, and then these all like are multiplications or divisions of your clocked LFO. Random. And then back to sine. If you hold and turn the encoder, it'll morph between this shape and the next one. So as we start morphing towards like the saw waves, this is similar to the morph control in the quadrax, but simplified a little bit. They're just cross-faded from one to the other. It gets interesting when you get towards the square and random, and then back over to the sine wave. You end up with like a mix of sine wave crossfade with a random, and you can get some pretty cool offset waves there. So that's kind of the main mode. You can also latch it, and this is a little bit more. I'm just going to get back to normal shape here. So let's say this is what we want as our base speed. If we latch this, now touching this is not going to change our base speed, but pressure on it is going to increase or decrease the speed, and then when you release, it's going to snap back. The amount of pressure towards the center of the pad is less effective than the pressure you give on the top or bottom end of the pad. And so if you press close to the middle to increase it, you have to press pretty hard to get it to go that hard. But if you do that at the top, you can have much more effect on the wave. And then similarly, when you press here, it'll slow it down a little bit, but when you go to the bottom and press, it'll slow it down a lot. But because you're latched, you're also snapping back to the original speed. Yeah, LFO. If we go to the red page on the LFO, turning the encoder will set the level again. So we can pre-attenuate this from 1 to 5 volts again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If you just want a like subtle thing and you don't have a attenuator on the other module or the destination module, then you can pre-attenuate here. Tapping the encoder here will toggle between bipolar, unipolar, positive, unipolar, negative, and then quantized, bipolar, quantized, unipolar, quantized, negative, unipolar. And so right now we're just in positive, and you can see that the bottom number disappeared. Now we're just in negative, so we have a negative 5 volt LFO. We're only getting from 0 to negative 5. If you tap once more, it goes to quantized versions of those. So now we're quantized, bipolar. We're in a volt per octave input here too. Just getting a little bit of... And then -5 quantized, and then, of course, the +5 quantized. Oops. Okay, back to normal. That's LFO mode. Like I said, you can get like partial shapes if you hold and turn the encoder, so you can get slightly more interesting than normal. Holding the encoder or just turning the encoder will snap back to the standard shapes. Okay, what else we got? That's it. Those are the modes. Let's cover the CV settings here, and then see where that takes us. Get some music. I want to point out, so like the LFOs is cool and all. You might be thinking like, well, I can do it with quadrats or I have a Dixie or whatever. The looper affects you record the modulations to your, it's more drastic here. You record the changes to these LFOs and the speed changes. You can also, because it's just recording the pad information, you can latch it at any point, and now the stuff you recorded in will play back as if you like were pressure changing the latched LFO. This is a very uninteresting destination. CV destinations, do this quick. The gate destinations are the same as, gate output destinations are the same as voltages mode. Same with the A and B outputs. So loop position, touch, start of sequence, end of sequence, run, stop, all those ones. The inputs are slightly different in here because we have four modes running at once. And so the way these are assigned, first you choose which pads or which columns it's going to affect. So you can do all 1, 2, 3, or 4, and then you can do pairs. So you can do 1 and 2, 2 and 3, 3 and 4, 1, 2 and 3, 2, 3, 4, and then you go back to all. And then you choose your destination. Some of them are global, so the all or 1, 2, 3, 4 won't affect it. But for ones that are ones that don't affect transport or that kind of thing, or loopy, will be per column based on your column setting. So if we set slew to all, that will affect slew on all of the channels. If we set slew to 1, that will only affect slew on the first channel, and the rest of your channels will be normal. You can also mix. So if you set this to 1 and slew, and then we also have Z set to slew, and we do it on 1 and 2, the slew on 1 will be the combination of the voltage on X and Y added together, whether it's positive or negative, and then applied to the slew on channel 1. Whereas the slew from Z will apply only to channel 2 by itself, and then it'll get mixed with X to apply to channel 1. Again, these are clocked, so you can clock them or sample and hold them against the clock, the trig, or pad presses. The pad presses in this one are per column. And so if you have this assigned to 1, that slew is only going to change and sample and hold when you touch the pad in column 1. The other ones are not going to affect it. If you have it set to all all touches will affect all pads as far as the sample and hold goes. Level. This is just like voltage mode. It's a built-in VCA. All of a sudden your voltage, if you set this and you don't have an input, all of a sudden your voltages are gonna drop to 0 because you need, let's plug an LFO into it. So you can see, if we go back to the main page and then just set this, you can see so we have a latched fader on the end here, should be outputting 2.5 volts or somewhere around there, but that's getting modulated by a LFO into X against level. We also have the offset control, which works the same. And so if we give it a negative offset, then it's going to apply against our outputs. If we have a bipolar fader, then I believe we're going to invert that. Yeah. Scale root, you can modulate that again, just like voltage mode. LFO rate, that will basically, it's linear, it's not exponential, and these they run at some sort of audio rate, but I wouldn't really call them an oscillator. But you can see I'm turning an attenuator you can't see on triplet, and that's affecting the input and then the rate. So you can modulate that with another channel, or, well, here, let's just modulate with this. So now the fader on this side is modulating the rate on the other side. LFO shape, so you can modulate between the shapes. It'll do the smooth crossfade based on that. That's maybe a more interesting thing to self-patch here. We can see our LFO on the side here. Slow it down a little bit. And then this morphing between shapes as we go. Euclid pulses. So this is, let's start a little drum kit here. Let's change this down to kick. If we go to the red page, like I said before, it'll show you a little bit more information about what's going on, rather than just the main page. If you see the number is inverted on a white square, that means that CV can affect it. And so now we have a fader plugged into X, which is affecting the number of pulses on X and Y. So with one movement or with a sequence movement, we can now affect those two channels on the first one. Or you can use an external source, of course. And so those are knocked. If you go back to the main page, you'll see the setting that you have dialed in there. The CV gets applied against that. And so if we set this at 8 and 8, then plus and minus 5 will either add 8 or minus 8 to the number. We can also set that 16 by holding and turning the encoder on the main screen. So now the second channel is 8 pulses over 8 steps. Now it's 1 pulse over 8 steps. And so that one's looping faster than the second one. You can also make them whatever you want, up to 64. So you can make one 25 and one like 13. And so the chances of those overlapping and you getting a repeating pattern, yeah. So things for stuff like hats or whatever, if you want to randomize it, just setting a slightly off number there will do quite a bit. And then you can see these values getting modulated. As you change the pulses, like those will change and adjust automatically. The range of the CV. You can also assign Euclid steps. This modulates the second value. Oops. So this is a little more where you would probably assign this to one channel as opposed to all of your channels. And then you can also assign Euclid rotation. So you can throw off that starting. I mentioned earlier when you touch the pad and it's not latched, that starts the rotation at 1 or at 0. You can modulate that so that when you do that, it starts your rotation late, or it starts your that voice like rotated or offset from where it would have been normally. And those are all of our CV assignments. And like I said, anything that applies directly to a mode can apply per pad, or to all the pads, or to a group of pads. I think that's combo mode. Loop length. Yeah, I'm just gonna scroll through and see if you guys have left any questions. CV notes. Get some music going while I do this. I don't see a ton of other questions added here. See Sunshine in there. Sunshine Jones on Instagram. He has a Tête right now. He's been doing some demos and stuff on there. If you want to see some other use cases. Yeah, I think that's about it. As far as presets go, pretty simple. So if we want to save this, we can pause it. Go to save, choose your file name, hit OK, and that saves it. If we recall, this is our original patch. It's the one we saved. It'll load up exactly kind of how you had it set originally. Yeah. We'll be just shooting a bunch of videos. Kind of covering each mode and kind of each piece of the mode. So we'll shoot some videos for the looper, shoot some videos for the sequencer, shoot some videos for combo mode, for each of the columns, things like that. Those will be rolling out kind of over the end of the year and then probably into next year. If you have any questions, you can hit us up at support. You can join us on our forums. You can ask questions on the video. I'll watch it for a few weeks. Make sure that everything gets answered. I think that's about it. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Enjoy the Tête. We worked really hard on it. And now it's out.